Well, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Rita. I'm from the Wood County Committee on Aging, and I'm very excited to introduce our special speaker today. So Judge Matt Reger, say hey.
Hello.
You're here and you're actually going to be talking about drug courts. So take it away. Thank you so much.
And I see Carlton just joined us too.
Yes.
And I guess you might want to tell him about the recording. I don't know.
Yes, Carlton, we are recording this session. Just a heads up if you would like to turn your camera off.
So we've done these before, and I've been asked to talk today about drug court. And before we get there, I kind of want to work on a little bit of history. But I want to also invite any questions. Now you can post the questions. I think you can either text them through the chat. You can post them through chat, or just turn off your microphone and state the questions, because really what keeps this moving and what makes it interesting is the questions. Before I get to drug court, I kind of want to start with where we are or how we got where we are. And actually, we're in a big state of change and of movement, really. And what I would say is that the area of drug enforcement, drug law, the entire area is just completely changing. I mean, today, right now, the state of Oregon has just made all drugs legal in certain amounts. So all drugs that were currently illegal, and when I say drugs, I want to refer to what we would call the typical illegal, or what we've referred to as scheduled drugs that the federal government schedules. So we're talking heroin, cocaine, marijuana, methamphetamine, things like that. So Oregon has gone a certain way in regard to legalization. The state of Colorado, as we know, has legalized marijuana for recreational use, as is Michigan and many other states. And there's a vast array of states throughout the country that have legalized marijuana on different levels and different situations. But I kind of want to go back, and really the history of this begins, interestingly, with the abolition movement in the early 19th century. There was a large outgrowth of people who formed what we call the abolition movement. Many of those were centered around churches and religious organizations, involved a lot of women. Women were very motivated by this, and so they became highly involved in it, as you know. And then now, what I'm saying is that they were a part of many of the organized movements that were advocating for the abolition through legal methods, through law or some other method. I think that it became pretty obvious that after the Dred Scott decision, that there was not going to be any kind of compromise that was going to bring about the end of slavery. So when the Civil War came and it ended, the people who were involved in abolition movement were still organized, and they were still gathering. And what they were gathering around is something that started to develop with the industrial age and also the development of the railroads. And that was the growth of alcohol use, excessive alcohol use. Doesn't mean excessive alcohol use wasn't happening before the Civil War. It was, but after the Civil War, it became a major problem that families were trying to deal with, particularly in the industrial area. So you think about the industrial age, men were then, for the first time, probably as we grow, going to work on a shift that might be a 10 to 12-hour shift. Family members might be going to it. And then when they got off their shift, they might be consuming alcohol, and then they might ignore the responsibilities of a family. And that was growing around the country. At the same time, there was use of use of drugs that was brought here or immigrated here from the East through the railroad development in those areas. And that continued to be. Opium was being used in large amounts. And so at the same time, there's a temperance movement. There's also a movement in regard to drugs. And really, there was no real accomplishment until, if you want to call it accomplishment, until the 1920s. Obviously, in the 1920s, we have prohibition. And then at the same time, we have development of laws banning or regulating in certain ways certain drugs, including marijuana, heroin, and the growthing of those drugs that are that influence those things, or that are part of those, that are derivatives. So the drugs that were derivatives of opium, the drugs that are derivatives of marijuana, those kind of things. Now, that is a rough sketch of the drug laws and the creation in the 1920s. It is not in any way an in-depth analysis. It doesn't bring into it all of the what I would call issues that were involved, and there's been a lot of documentation of racist motivations for the banning of marijuana, which I think has some factual basis that could be looked at. But in any event, that's kind of a general idea, is that the people who were involved with the abolition movement grew into the temperance movement and also worked within the development to ban drugs. So 1920s, 1930s, you have the proliferation of laws that ban drugs. Hello and welcome.
Hi, thank you. Sorry I'm late.
No, it's okay. And so what we just did is we talked about basically the banning of drugs that developed through the late 19th century and into the early 20th century. And so that ends up being the law for a long time. That's the standard law. And I would say that the enforcement of it was in, I would say that there was enforcement, but it wasn't in the broad way that came when we had the war on drugs after the 60s and 70s. And we know that the war on drug comes in the 1980s, and we have a large amount of incarceration of individuals for drug possession, drug use, drug trafficking, all of those things. And across the United States, that was the case. And then we have the 1990s when we were having a proliferation of crack cocaine and the dangers that were associated with that. And understand, as drug laws grew, there was an associated crime that they were trying to address in general. And so then we had the 1990s crime and legislation. And I understand this, is I think you have to put it in perspective, is that there was, I think there's a need to look at somewhat popular culture. In the 1960s, you have the growth of constitutional rights for defendants, and also the development of broad use of some illegal drugs by different categories of society. And so that led into a perception, and some of that supported by facts, of a growth in crime. And so that led to a reaction that would be in the 1980s of lots of crime legislation towards enhancing criminal penalties. If you remember, California had a 3 strikes and you're out type crime bill. And so it's this swinging pendulum, if I want to call it. You know, you have it that swings one way towards greater rights. So there's 2 models within the criminal justice area. There's a crime control model and there's a due process model. The crime control model says, you know, we need to control crime, we need to address the issues of crime. And then the other model says we need to protect the rights of those who are accused. And so it's trying to be in the middle of those, but there's a swinging back and forth of that pendulum. Also in the late 1980s, early 1990s, you have what's called the broken window theory. The broken window theory began in the city of New York to address certain crimes. The idea is that if you address minor crimes being disorderly conduct, small possessions of marijuana, different things, the smaller crimes, then you will address the bigger ones and you'll have a greater effect on the bigger ones. The idea behind the broken window theory is that if a house has a broken window and you don't fix it, then it will tear down the rest of the neighborhood. The rest of the neighborhood becomes affected by it. So you have this growth in law enforcement, the broken window theory. You have basically enhanced penalties. You have more people in prison and more people being incarcerated. And then you get to this point in the early 2000s when there's kind of a swinging back of that pendulum. And people are saying, you know, we've been having this war on drugs for 20, 30 years now, and we haven't addressed it. We still have a drug problem. There's got to be a better way of dealing with it. And some people were promoting the idea of legalization as a method. And in that time, the courts were starting to try to come up with different ideas of how to address situations. And part of that comes out of that broken window theory of policing. The broken window theory of policing was that not only do you, charge the person for the minor offenses, you get involved with them in the criminal justice system to try and address it. And those are some of the theories of rehabilitative justice. If you remember a name from Watergate was Chuck Colson. Chuck Colson was a early promoter of the idea of rehabilitative justice, where we don't just incarcerate somebody, we try to find ways to solve the problem and bring solutions. That was part of the idea of community policing and community enforcement. And so out of all of this, out of the idea of rehabilitative justice and community policing idea, comes this idea of specialized courts. And specialized courts were meant to address a particularized situation with an individual on a very personal basis. And what they were saying is that if you address the person holistically, address all of their issues, because they weren't doing drugs just because they're doing drugs, just because they're illegal. There was something broader going on in their lives, and you were trying to address all of that. There was definitely mental health issues. There's definitely societal issues. There's definitely relationship issues, who they hang out with, who they are involved with, and having the court involved in a way, we'll say intimately with the individual, as opposed to just reporting to a probation officer once a month or something like that. And understand that this grew or started to grow in the inner city, where the involvement with a particular defendant who's involved in the criminal justice system may be impersonal. Maybe they only show up once a quarter or once a month or just once in a while, and there's no real relationship. And so there was no real understanding of what the bigger picture of what their drug use was. Where was that coming from? And so the drug court was meant to be an idea of having this individual report on a weekly basis to begin with to the court, along with all of their treatment providers, to address the issues that are involved with their lives, be it treatment, be it mental health issues, be it familial. You know, there was a realization that the issues involved with an individual who are using drugs were not just limited to the use of drugs. They could be, maybe they've got issues involving where they're living, or maybe they don't have a place to live, or maybe there's family issues, or, you know, the other issues is that, you know, we say, well, they get a job. Well, maybe they're the hindrances to getting a job were having a license or having the capacity to be able to have a job. And so drug court is meant to bring all of the treatment providers, all of the community providers, and have them address in a holistic way that particular defendant as they are on probation. And it grew out of the cities where basically, like I said, you'd have a particular situation where you didn't have the individualized treatment that you might have in a smaller community. So I've kind of done a general throw out there. I don't know if there's some specific questions you'd like to ask. I can go on, and I'm going to, but but I wanted to at least open up right now for any questions. We're about 20 minutes in, and I wanted to see if there's any kind of questions specifically you wanted to ask as it relates to drug court or drug laws. I see we've got another person join us, I think. So any specific questions you wanted me to go on to?
Do you think keeping people who have been convicted of some kind of drug, maybe paraphernalia problem, keeping them on probation, and part of that probation is that they have to seek treatment, stay on treatment, they have to take their medications, have drug tests and such different things like that to help them along?
Well, let me tell you this, is that's a great question. And what I would say is that a person who is involved in drug addiction, I'm going to give you a broad statement. A person who is involved in drug addiction or who is addicted to drugs, be it alcohol, be it illegal drugs, be it whatever, to escape that, they cannot do it on their own. I don't know many people who I've ever seen who can do it on their own. That we've heard, I know we've had the situation where somebody's gone cold turkey on something, and I would say that's more the exception than the rule. There has to be somebody or some group of people who show some kind of interest and willingness to help the individual escape from the what I would say is the clinging of drugs and drug addiction. So, I think that's one thing that is very important to say, is that there needs to be somebody to help the person escape from drug addiction. I don't know what your experience has been. You may know somebody who's been either an alcoholic or drug addicted or addicted to something else. And I don't know what your feelings are on that, but in my experience in doing this for 25 years is that people I've seen, the real successes happen and the long-term successes happen when somebody is there to assist them. I always use this as my little analogy that I give people who are going on probation. I'm a big proponent of AA. I think it works. I've seen it work with a lot of people. Some people may not find it to be, I think the model works. It doesn't have to be within the same context, but having somebody who calls you to task to stay sober is a very good model. And so I always tell the story about the guy who falls into the hole. And I have this on my bench and I have it right there and I'll read it sometimes to defendants. So it's a guy falls in a hole and a priest comes along and he says, "Father, can you get me out of this hole?" And the priest writes down a prayer and throws it in the hole and walks on. A doctor comes up to the hole. The guy says, "Doc, can you help me? Get me out of this hole." The doctor writes a prescription, throws it in the hole and walks on. Now, the guy in the hole, his best friend comes along. He says, "Joe, can you get me out of the hole?" And Joe jumps into the hole. And the guy says, "What in the world are you doing? Now we're both in the hole." He says, "Yeah, but I've been here before. I know the way out." And so when I tell that story, my point is that, we need people alongside of us, caring for us and helping us out of these situations, out of these holes. Okay, I could get into a historical aspect of this if you want to look at it in a broader view of 200 years, is that the Industrial Revolution kind of made us less intimate with each other. It destroyed those connections in some ways. And so therefore people became less human, maybe. And so therefore less of a willingness to assist other people through their situations. Now, that's a generalized statement. It's not accurate for everything, but I think it has some merit. Maybe you don't, I don't know. It's something I throw out there. But I do think that when we become more involved with our neighbors and their situations, and we provide help to them. That's the idea of the drug court, is to provide that assistance and to bring the resources together to concentrate on one person. Okay. So that's a great question, is the recidivism. So the question is did you cover recidivism? I haven't covered recidivism yet. What happens if a person gets arrested 10 times or more for possession? I've read it can take 10 relapses until a person gets past addiction. Yeah, here's what we deal with. So let me walk you through what we deal with here. The Wood County Court of Common Pleas does not have a drug court at this time. I have visited many drug courts. I've looked at many drug courts. I like the model. I like what they're doing. But I think that what we do here in many regards is as good as a drug court. And in some cases, we have taken certain cases and said, this person needs to be treated like they're in a drug court. So let me give you a situation. So I have a person, I recently had a person, here's the scenario. The person was originally arrested for child endangerment and possession of cocaine. And what happened is they were using cocaine while they were breastfeeding their child. Now, they're charged, and we try to start out with the idea of let's put this person into some kind of treatment program. Now, we have what's called intervention in lieu of conviction. An intervention in lieu of conviction is a person pleads guilty to an offense, and then there is a court withholds a finding of guilty and allows them to complete a treatment program or a probation-like program. And if they complete it successfully, then the case is dismissed and they can expunge the sentence. But with this person, this particular scenario is that we were going down the path of intervention in lieu, but then she was misleading us and lying basically about a lot of things, just about everything, about treatment and everything she was doing. So the state decided not to go down that line, and she pled guilty to the charges, which were not eligible for intervention in lieu. So we put her on community control. We started her on community control. We started out with what we call intensive supervision, where she meets with a probation officer once a week and goes through a treatment program. Well, she fell off the wagon on that one. So then we gave her an inpatient program. And she did the inpatient program. And then she got out and she seemed to be doing well. But then there was more lies and more involvement in other things that were wrong. So we did a violation of probation. We brought her in, she admitted. We continued her on probation and said, we'll set out disposition to a later date. In between that time, she decided to submit fraudulent AA slips to show that she'd gone to AA. Once again, we bring her in saying, well, you're giving these fraudulent AA slips. I'm going to continue her on community control again. But we're setting out disposition to a later date to see if she sticks with the program. Well, then she comes in and tells me about all she's doing that's well in the program. She's involved in these things. And then she provides me with some letters. But then we find out those letters are fraudulently made, that she made them up.
Oh, geez.
And so we came to a situation where we were in an impasse. We had provided every kind of resource that we could. And so now we were at the situation where the only resource left was a prison term. And so we placed her into prison. I would say in general that an individual who is sent to prison, before they are sent to prison, they have had, with that particular case, at least 5, maybe up to 7 different opportunities to remain to remain on probation and not go to prison. Now, that's with that particular case. Now, if you take the history, so usually a person when they come to felony court have already had maybe several other minor offenses in misdemeanor court, and they've been afforded some kind of treatment program
Mm.
before they even get to common pleas. And so there's been several different treatment programs, and they've still not been able to adhere to them. Well, the children in that case, now in that particular case, the husband was making somewhere around $900,000 a year. And so the husband could take the children and keep the children. JFS was involved. Now, that was an extraordinary situation.
Mhm.
A more likely situation is that both parents are involved in some kind of drug addiction and the kids get taken away, maybe put into another family that's part of the family, or maybe getting put into foster care. You see, that's one of the things is that when we talk about legalization of drugs, there doesn't seem to be an ancillary discussion about the effect of drugs on our social network. What happens to the children of these people? What happens to the family members? What happens to all of the other things that are related to them? Nobody, very few, I would say, people, I mean, I'm going to tell you nobody, and then you're going to come up with an example, but I would say most people, their use of drugs doesn't just affect them. Their addiction to drugs doesn't just affect them. There's somebody else affected. Who that person is and how they are affected may not be, it depends on how bad it affected, but it has some kind of effect.
Yeah, that's a good one.
Yeah, Carlton.
Here in Lucas County, we're in our 7th year of this DART program, which is a drug abuse response team that Lucas County Sheriff John Tharp started up. And it was one of the first, if not the first of its kind in the country. And I've heard a lot of good comments about it. I guess my question is, this is a county program. I don't know if the state has something comparable, and why don't we have a federal program?
Well, that's a great idea. That's a great point. Let me back up. That's a great point. I want to tell you, I think the DART program is one of the great programs out there. I think it's an exceptional program. And I've met with Sheriff Tharp about it, and also Lucas County has a great drug court program. Judge Ian English does a great job. I've gone up and I've watched his drug court. I think that in regard to why isn't there, I would say that the DART program has been modeled throughout the state in other counties. And other counties do have it. In Wood County, we have what's called the ARC program, ARC. It has been promoted and established by our county prosecutor. And it's meant to get involved in people when they overdose, when EMT people are called out. That's the same thing that the DART program has. It does put, I will say this, is that any of those programs put law enforcement in a strange position. Police officers are trained to investigate and investigate crimes and arrest bad people. What we're trying to create into police officers is to make them social workers and to almost overlook illegal activity so that they can assist this person. Not saying, I would say the officers do a great job of that. In regard to statewide, I want to say that I think there's been a lot of promotion of the program statewide. I know that there are state funds available. I would say that, that's a hard question, okay? I can tell you that any program that works well on a local level, when you take that program and that idea and you give it to the federal government to emulate throughout the country, it fails. And the reason it fails is because it's not anything bad about the federal government. They want to do a good job. They want to do it right. It's just that when you add all of that bureaucracy, it takes away from the individualism that's involved. I mean, the reason that DART works in Lucas County is because those officers generally know the people that they're involved with. I think that you are right. that drug addiction is a public health issue. Well, Wood County needs a home for recovering addicts for both male and female. Housing is an issue along with transportation. You are completely right that those are the situations. There is a Wood County home though for drug addicts. There's not enough. I would say that. There's the positive, negative. The positive is we need a home for people who are in Wood County who are drug addicts. The negative is what about all those people who come into the county just because you've got a home for drug addicts? And so that becomes an issue. And how long do you need to be a Wood County resident until you provide that home, that housing for them? I'm not trying to be a naysayer here, please. These are all great ideas. I think there are solutions. And let me tell you where I think those solutions lie. I think there are organized groups out there that could attack this issue, but I think they're maybe intimidated, maybe don't know. And I think a lot of it is churches. I think that the religious community could work at some of the solutions on this, but I think sometimes they don't know where to start or how to start or where to go. And everybody has their ideas. I mean, within Wood County, we have several different programs meant to help people get rehabilitated and off of drugs. And every program has their positives and every program has their negatives. And so they're all trying. And I don't know that you could take any program. No program seems to have a silver bullet. AA seems to have one of the best models, as I said, but it works just because it only works if you have individuals who are devoted to helping other individuals. And usually you have to take addicts to help other addicts. And let's look at some reality too, is that take the family member that's involved with the addict. It's the same family members sometimes who are involved with the individual with mental health issues. In some cases, these people have not been dealing with it for a year or 2 years. They've been dealing with it for 20 years, 30 years, their entire life. They've been dealing with this person who's either addicted and maybe there's an associated mental health issue and trying to resolve their issues and trying to help them out. And they've given everything they can to that person and still nothing works. So that's an aspect out there. I'm not trying to put a negative veil on this. I just want you to look at some of the realities of the situation that we're dealing with. So, like when we bring somebody to the court, that person comes to us. I want to give you a picture of the person who comes to the court. Take an individual who I have in front of me who's 33 years old. He's charged with, let's say, involuntary manslaughter because he sold drugs to another person who sold or gave drugs to a person who overdosed. What do we do with that person? Now, I want to give you a history on that person. That person started using drugs when he was 9 or 10 years old because parents weren't involved. Parents were either divorced or weren't involved or had drug addiction issues of their own. They started with marijuana. That is invariably, that seems to be the scenario. They started with marijuana. They moved then by the time they were 15 to maybe cocaine. By the time they're 18, they've tried or used heroin and they're addicted and they're continuing to use. Throughout their 20s, they've gone and tried to deal with the addiction over and over in different ways. Maybe they've been involved with the court system. And then here it is. It's they're 32 years old. They're still using. They have some. They've sold some to a friend. And that friend sends it to another person. And that person who they sold it to has been clean for a few months. And then decides, I want to use. And they went back to what they were using before they were clean. And that's too much. People quickly get the heroin out of their system and their ability to handle it. And so then what they do is if they let's say they use so many cc's when they're addicted, and then each time it's a little bit more so that they can get that high, because if they don't get enough, they don't get the high. Then let's say they're off of it for 3 months. Well, if they use that amount they last used, it's probably going to kill them. And so those are the circumstances that people are in a lot of times. Okay, I've covered a lot of area. I've been a little negative in some cases. I don't want to be. I'd like to answer some more questions if there's some out there. The hard part, I understand why none of you want to be videotaped, but the hard part is actually seeing the faces and kind of reading them. I'd love to see, this is really, I'm trying to be interactive. I'm not trying to just throw you my ideas. I'm telling you what I see. And I don't want to be negative. So any thoughts? What do you see?
You mentioned AA, Judge.
Yeah.
How about NA?
NA follows the same theory as AA. I think it's a very good and program. What I want to say is this: any program that has you be accountable to somebody else has a greater possibility of success.
I just thought maybe NA would pinpoint or be more specific to the addicts problem than
It definitely is. It definitely is. And when I use AA, I'm also throwing in NA in there. But anytime that you are responsible for calling you, and whenever I am individually responsible for calling attention to my addiction or my failures, I'm going to fail at that. Because, I am not going to come in and say, I've really messed up my complete life. Every decision I've ever made is wrong. It's just hard. You can't do that. Other thoughts out there?
Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I think you really touched on something with the Industrial Revolution. We don't get to know each other, and there's something to be said for neighbors and communities that do good for another person, and sometimes it's like a witch hunt, But anyway, saying that, I just remember we live here in Point Place in Michigan border, and there was a Block Watch meeting, and they had, I forgot the name of the organization, but it was recovering addicts. For the terminology changes so much, I'm always afraid I'm going to say the wrong term. And they were wonderful. What they do is they all live at one place, and either they volunteer or they work and they support each other. And they were there, and they weren't asking for pity or anything. They just wanted to put a human face on it. And I think if there was more human faces on these things, because sometimes you can get on groups and people, just the language they use to describe people, and I think you have to know that they're people, and I admire the patience with that person who just kept on lying and everything, and fifth, sixth, seventh chances. You never know, it might be the fifth chance or something. I don't know. It's just an
No, I think
observation.
you know what, Janice, you are completely on point. And what I want to say is this, is that I'm not trying to, we live in a society where we
Yeah.
are more disconnected from people.
Exactly.
And
Yeah. And it's so easy to just get on Facebook and just spout, because you don't realize that words hurt people. So that's my latest when people spout up. I go, words matter. And I just keep it short. Words matter. They really do.
So the next question I have,
Yeah.
follow through after release from jail with the liaison to programs and probation. And if marijuana invariably leads to harsher drugs, what will it be like when marijuana becomes legal? Carol, I don't have an answer to that. You know what? Here's the thing that we're dealing with structurally. I have individuals who are on probation, and we don't allow them to use marijuana. I know that marijuana leads to the use of other drugs. I'm convinced of that. I know that there's been a lot of people who discount what they call is the gateway drug of marijuana. I don't know if it's gateway or not, but I can tell you that invariably the people I've seen addicted. So let me put it to you this way. Not everyone who uses marijuana is going to go on to use heroin, cocaine, and everything else. But everyone who's addicted to marijuana, addicted to heroin, cocaine, has started out with marijuana. That's at least my observation. And at least I think some of the documentation shows that that's where they started out. Now, that doesn't mean, so when you have it, that it's being legalized in states, what happens? What's the outgrowth of that? What becomes of that? I mean, I guess I'm just trying to figure that out. Where does it go to, and why is it so necessary that it be available? I don't know. I don't have the answers to that. You know, I will tell you, I was one of those people a long time ago. I'd say, well, I really don't like people being criminalized for the use of marijuana. But at the same time, how do you address the societal ills that result from marijuana? Now, some would say, well, just arrest them for the burglary and the other things that they're committing. And that's true, but how do you address crime prevention? And so those are kind of the things that are out there. I'm just saying that those are the issues. I have lots of people who I've dealt with as a prosecutor and as a judge who've told me that marijuana is the most effective drug they've had to deal with their either bipolar situation or some other mental health or physical situation. And they believed in it. And so I allowed them to use it while they were on probation, and I didn't hold it against them. Same thing goes for people with MS in some cases. They've used it and found it to be very effective. I'm not questioning that. But how do we address the other social ills that come out of this?
Education. I mean, I think if people are given an informed choice, I won't go into detail, but I've come across a lot of things. Marijuana does have some really bad side effects. You know, it really does. And yet I don't think I want to criminalize it. You know, so I'm on the fence too, you know, but I really think in school, maybe there could be more education about what it does, what it can do to you. Not to take it away from the MS, you know, people with MS.
Right, I don't know what the situation. I don't
Yeah.
know. Now there's a question there. If marijuana is legal, how will police or workplaces handle situations?
Yeah.
Well, the police won't be able to arrest people for the use of it. But I would say this is that in workplaces, an employer can always make a requirement that you not use marijuana. They can make a requirement that you not use alcohol. They can make requirements. Now, I can tell you there's a reality out there with a lot of employers. A lot of employers were pretty strict with their drug tests, and then they found out that they couldn't find employees, so they stopped doing drug tests so they could get employees.
Oh my.
That's a reality out there that exists. Other questions? Julie.
The thing with the employers is if you get injured while you're on the job and you're on drugs, your insurance won't cover that.
True.
Because you're impaired. Now, when my son worked, right, he was in high school and he worked at Ed Schmidt. He's the only one that could move cars around the parking lot because the only one that didn't have a DUI. And so their insurance would cover if one of their employees, you know, moving cars damaged something or was injured. So he got a lot of easy jobs. He got to drive the shuttle and do all that cool stuff because he'd never done drugs or alcohol. But kids don't seem to realize it, and then they get it on their record, and it's hard to get off.
That's true. That's true. You know, we could do a whole section on what kids don't realize, and that they do all the time. But you're right. But employers have the ability to restrict somebody's use of drugs and alcohol. And it is a lot of ways developed through insurance companies. Insurance companies are not going to, they're going to either raise your rates or not insure you if you're going to hire people who use drugs or who drink on the job.
I I was in the National Guard, Judge, for 20 years, and I think it was in the last 5 or 6 years that I was in. Drug tests were the routine, and guardsmen were warned first, on first offense, and I think it was about the third offense that they were actually kicked out of the Guard. And I wonder how that's going to be handled by the military if marijuana, becomes legal nationwide. How the military is going to handle that? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, the military, once again, can limit the use. People are using firearms, and they can, the military can make its own rules as to what it wants. I think that one, begets the other. If there's a legalization of marijuana, then the military is going to be pressured to allow servicemen to use it. I don't know where that goes. I'm a little bit concerned always when the military becomes a proving ground for social programming, but we'll see what happens.
Well, as far as cigarette smoking is concerned, that was very prevalent in my growing up years. Most in high school, most of the boys smoked, none of the girls. And then later on, the commercials were on television. John Wayne was out there, and the health risk were put on the packages of the cigarettes, and even the passive smoking, hazardous to your health, yada yada yada, and restricted, banned in workplaces and inside, public places, and even entrances outside to some places. They ban it. Something like that, like Janice was saying, education and maybe health risks as far as marijuana.
Well, the education part I think is important. I think though, you take smoking as a thing. What ended up happening with smoking is that there was this 30-year education almost. And it was almost a re-education, because if you went back, I can remember my great uncle, he was having some heart problems, and the doctor recommended he smoke cigarettes to calm himself down. Doctors had recommended it. If you look at advertising back in the 50s, they would have doctors on smoking advertisements saying that, oh, it's healthy, it's okay for you, it's good for you. And then you look at the smoking advertisements, 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s. So it took re-education in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and through the 90s to basically change public's perception and opinions about smoking. And if you remember, what we take for granted today, think about this. What we take for granted today is that you enter into a restaurant and nobody smokes. Remember when that started? That was only 15 years ago. And people were up in arms saying, this is outrageous. You're infringing upon the rights of smokers. When I lived overseas, that's the one thing you notice whenever you go overseas is when you go to France, you go into a restaurant, people are smoking. Okay. It's like stepping back into another age in the United States. And, so it was a re-education. We almost have to do the same thing. And I don't know, if there's enough reliable information out there about marijuana to explain to people, or if people are willing to listen about both the positives and the negatives of marijuana, because there's some negatives. Okay. I mean, you got to kind of go with that. And I don't know that people are entering into the use of marijuana with their eyes wide open and their knowledge. I mean, if you take a medication, if the doctor prescribes medication to you, you also find out from the doctor, what are the side effects? And when you're given those side effects, you kind of do a balancing. Well, this is going to help me do this, but boy, I don't know if I like those side effects. And that's kind of the thing that people aren't doing when they, what they know is what they think are the positives of marijuana, or and it's not just marijuana. When we talk about heroin and cocaine and methamphetamines and fentanyl and things like that, people aren't looking at the side effects or what the effects are, the long-term effects. Marijuana, there's no idea what the long-term effects are because they've not been able to test it because it's been illegal.
As far as taxation, cigarettes today, I believe, I think it costs more for one single cigarette than it did for a whole pack back in, the 50s and 60s.
Yeah.
And maybe that's something they have to do with the marijuana, just tax the heck out of it and try to control it that way.
Well, and I'm not disagreeing with that, but understand this, and I do not disagree with that, but I want you to look at this perspective. I think about this: is who do those taxes affect?
The poor.
The poor.
Yeah.
I mean, poor people are the ones. It's the most regressive tax around.
Mm-hmm.
The only one worse is gambling.
Yeah.
It does not affect people who are rich, people who are, make a large, who are in the high income. They don't care. Doesn't affect them. It's poor people. And poor people are the ones who end up getting caught in the web because they don't have as much information always.
Mm-hmm.
And, let's broaden it a little more than that, okay? Is that if you're poor, sometimes the only relief you get from your daily life is that cigarette. I mean, I don't mean that negatively.
Yeah.
What I mean is that for some people, that is their luxury. That's the luxury thing that they use. And so the real people who get hurt by it is the children of poor people who are addicted to smoking. We're getting near the end, and so I wanted to open it up. I think that's a great point with Carol. It does affect your brain. I don't know how it rewires it, but I've seen enough people who've used marijuana for a long time, who began it when they were young, and it seems to rewire them in a way that's just kind of scary. But I don't want this just to be about my opinions. I'm kind of trying to share what we do in court.
Yeah.
Are there other questions? Anything? I've tried to give you a kind of a perspective on how drug court works. The idea is, so let me give you the perspective. Typically, a person who's in drug court is either in what we call intervention in lieu. They've pled guilty to the offense they're charged with, and there's been a withholding of a finding of guilty, and they're put in drug court, and there's different phases of drug court. The first phase, they're meeting with the judge and the treatment providers once a week. And then they graduate to every other week. Then they graduate to once a month. And then they graduate to once a quarter. And then they're ready to graduate out of the program. There can be violations while they're in there, but there's only so many violations, and they're kicked out of the drug court program, found guilty of the offense that they're convicted of. And then they are then sentenced in that way. And let me tell you, so the reality here is that a person goes on intervention in lieu. So let's say we have somebody in intervention in lieu. They pled guilty to the offense. We put them on 2 years of this monitoring, what we call like probation. If they violate once, we're going to give them a second chance. So we give them a second chance. At that second chance, if they violate again, depending on what the violation is, we might give them a third chance. Or we may just find them guilty, and then we put them on probation. And then we've got them in probation, and we give them a program there. And let's say they violate probation. So then they violate probation. Well, we're going to continue them on probation and try something else. Then they violate probation again. And depending on what kind of probation probation violation it is, we may give them continue them on probation, or terminate probation and send them to prison. And in some cases, I would tell you that the reality is that on felony 4s and felony fives, the state has made it more difficult for us to send people to prison. And so we're not sending them to prison.
Hmm.
Ultimately, on F4s and F5s, people are really, in general, are not going to prison right away.
Wow. Huh.
So I've got 2 minutes left, or maybe a minute. So anything last before I go?
Well, here in North Toledo, Judge, Point Place, there's a lot of crime going on. I'm talking about breaking into cars, breaking windows. And, you hear on Facebook, there's a number of groups. People are really irate about this. They're even saying if I ever catch somebody doing that to my car or vandalizing my property, I'm going to shoot them. It's got, and most of it, through the grapevine, the Facebook is drug related. They're feeding their habit.
Sure.
So, this is an ongoing thing. When we say felony 4, felony 5, is this kind of vandalism, breaking into cars, looking for money to feed their habit? Are those felony 4s, 5s that you're speaking of? Okay.
Yes.
So,
Yes.
so they probably going through this probation and so forth, and still out there to keep going, and but you give them so many opportunities to turn it around. And
Yep.
okay, I wasn't sure when you said
Nope, that's
felony
the
4,
kind of cases we're talking about.
4s and 5s. Okay.
Yep.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you
Very
so
much.
much. We
Thank
sure
you.
do. We appreciate the valuable information and the opportunity to discuss.
Well, I really enjoy it. I appreciate you. I appreciate your comments. And I know that we're trying to set one up for next month. So get some information to Rita and her office and tell me what topics you'd like for the next time.
Oh, okay. Will do.
Great.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much. My
Thank you so
pleasure.
much.
Okay.
Have a nice day.
You too. Take
you-
care.
Bye.
Thanks, Rita.